The sea was quiet that morning, a grey silence rolling over the Norwegian coast, when a young lieutenant stood alone in the conning tower of a tired German U-boat. Below him, 16 men climbed into rubber dinghies, their paddles cutting small, hesitant circles into the cold water. They were husbands, fathers, men who still had someone waiting for them on land. And as they drifted away, their silhouettes shrinking into the fog, Heinz Schäffer understood that those who remained aboard U-977 had just crossed a different kind of boundary, one no map had ever marked. Germany had surrendered. The war was finished, at least for the world above. But inside the steel hull, war had left a final question lingering in the diesel-thick air surrender and face whatever awaited defeated submariners, or attempt something unthinkable, something that might offer one last sliver of hope. What followed would become one of the most improbable voyages in naval history, an audacious submarine escape to Argentina, carried out by a weary World War II submarine clinging to life beneath the Atlantic. But why did these men choose the ocean over captivity? And how did U-977 survive a journey that by all logic should have killed them long before reaching South America? He was only 24 years old, but Heinz Schäffer had already seen the full arc of the U-boat war, its early triumphs, its slow suffocation beneath Allied radar sonar and unrelenting patrols. Born in Berlin in 1921, he joined the Kriegsmarine at 18, serving on U-561 and U-445, watching friends vanish into the Atlantic without a trace. He earned decorations for courage, yet something essential had eluded him. He had never commanded a World War II submarine on a combat patrol. His first chance came late, far too late, December 1944, when he assumed command of a battered German U-boat, the Type VII U-977. Even calling the vessel seaworthy demanded a kind of optimism. She had been rammed 3 times during training. Her pressure hull was fatigued, her batteries worn down to 70%, and though she carried a newly installed snorkel, the device was temperamental at best. In the spring of 1945, when Germany's cities were burning and its armies collapsing, U-977 received the final desperate order: penetrate the defenses of Southampton and attack British shipping. It was a suicide mission, and everyone aboard knew it. But before the submarine could even approach the English coast, the radios crackled with a different command, one that dissolved the very authority of war. On May 8, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered all U-boats to surface, report their positions, and proceed to the nearest Allied port for surrender. Most crews obeyed immediately. They had fought their war. Now they would go where fate took them. For Schäffer and his men, the moment was heavier. Many were teenagers, 19, 18. Some had barely learned the rhythms of the sea. They crowded inside the control room, the air thick with diesel fumes and sweat, when Schäffer gathered them together that evening. Germany had capitulated. The Kriegsmarine had ceased to exist, and an officer, barely older than many of them, told them they now faced a choice no manual had prepared them for. He laid out 3 paths. They could follow the order and surrender to the British, accepting imprisonment with no certainty about how they would be treated. They could attempt to reach neutral Spain, though internment there offered little comfort. Or he paused. They could attempt something almost unimaginable, a direct submarine escape to Argentina. Argentina, though technically at war with Germany, had declared so only weeks earlier under American pressure. It remained sympathetic home to a large German community. To the weary men of U-977, it represented something increasingly rare possibility. The decision wasn't easy. They argued, debated, weighed fear against hope. Ultimately, a majority chose Argentina. 16 men, all married, chose a different future. They asked to be put ashore. They couldn't abandon their families for a voyage that could last months if it succeeded at all. Before dawn on May 10th, U-977 surfaced near the stony shore of Holsenoy. Schäffer watched from the conning tower as those 16 men lowered themselves into dinghies and paddled toward a fog-veiled coastline. Within days, they would be in Allied hands. The 32 who remained turned toward the Atlantic. Behind them lay a lost homeland. Before them lay 600 miles of uncertainty and ocean patrolled by victors and a battered World War II submarine, barely held together by willpower and rusted steel. Yet they believed they had a chance. And sometimes belief is all a crew has left. The first week at sea gave the illusion that this voyage might somehow be ordinary. The waters between Scotland and Iceland were familiar to Heinz Schäffer, and the crew of U-977 still carried the restless energy of men who believed endurance was simply a matter of discipline. During daylight, the battered German U-boat settled at snorkel depth, about 40 feet below the surface, its pipe barely breaking the waves. One diesel engine ran at its slowest throttle to conserve fuel. At night, when darkness offered brief shelter, Schäffer surfaced just long enough to ventilate the boat and charge the failing batteries. But by the second week, the ocean began to push back. The snorkel's float valve, meant to seal the pipe whenever a wave passed overhead, started sticking. When it jammed shut, the diesel engines sucked oxygen, not from the sea, but from inside the submarine. The pressure dropped. Men clutched their ears as pain exploded through their skulls, eardrums rupturing. Others fainted where they stood. The crew began to call it snorkel torture, and on this World War II submarine, it became a daily ritual of fear. Above them, Allied victory had transformed the Atlantic into a vast net of detection. Radar could spot a snorkel's metal head 10 miles away. Sonobuoys drifted in grid patterns, listening for the hum of engines. Magnetic anomaly detectors swept the sea from aircraft overhead. In the last 4 months of the war, 1 to 20 U-boats had vanished into this killing field. 3 out of every 4 submariners never returned home. And now, a lone German U-boat, fleeing a war already lost, was threading its way through the same gauntlet. Inside U-977, the psychological weight grew heavier than the steel hull around them. The constant motion at snorkel depth made sleeping nearly impossible. Canned food turned to paste in their mouths. The air stank of diesel sweat and confinement. One 17-year-old sailor from Munich began whispering that he heard water seeping through imaginary cracks. He counted rivets along the bulkheads until he collapsed from exhaustion. Schäffer knew the signs: U-boat neurosis, the invisible enemy that stalked every crew trapped in deep water. Yet the young commander had no traditional authority left. The Kriegsmarine no longer existed. Germany itself barely existed. He could not court-martial a man for refusing duty. All he had was the fragile loyalty that men share when they realize survival depends on each other more than on any flag. Trouble worsened in late May. One night, sonar picked up the thunder of propellers, many propellers. A convoy, likely, a dozen ships thundered toward them. Schäffer ordered the boat deep pushing to 200 feet. The hull creaked under the pressure. Paint dust drifted from the bulkheads. The men lay still, listening for depth charges that never came. For a moment they believed they had outsmarted the Atlantic. But the ocean remembers. And U-977, pressing farther west, with each passing day, was only beginning to understand the true cost of its chosen path toward that distant submarine escape to Argentina. By early June, the sea itself seemed to change temperament. As U-977 pushed southward, cold Atlantic water gave way to warmer currents, and the interior of the German U-boat transformed into a suffocating chamber. At snorkel depth, the water outside hovered around 75 degrees. Inside, sealed from ventilation for most of the day, the temperature soared past 95. In the engine room, it reached 110. Metal sweated. Clothing never dried. Mold crept across bedding like a slow infection. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Their gums bled from the first signs of scurvy. With the medical kit nearly empty, the young medic, barely 22, treated infections with whatever he had left, even smearing engine grease onto raw skin, simply because it was the only substance that resisted bacteria. Each day, Heinz Schäffer watched his crew shrink not in number, but in spirit. Then came the first disaster. On June 20th, after more than 40 days at sea, the port diesel engine seized with a shuddering crack. Salt water had infiltrated the lubrication system through a corroded gasket, destroying the bearings. Schäffer understood immediately. Losing one engine meant losing speed, losing diesel efficiency, and losing their narrow margin of hope in this fragile submarine escape to Argentina. The voyage, once improbable, now bordered on impossible. Morale plummeted. A 19-year-old mechanic refused to stand watch, insisting he was too sick to function. One sailor attempted to open a torpedo tube from the inside, desperate for an exit that didn't exist. In a navy without a nation, Schäffer couldn't punish them. Instead, he appealed to what little remained of their solidarity. "We make it together," he told them quietly, "or we do not make it at all." But the ocean was not finished with them. On July 4th, the remaining diesel engine overheated. The cooling water intake was clogged, likely with seaweed and barnacles. Unless cleared, the engine would fail within hours. Without it, the batteries would die. Without batteries, they couldn't maneuver, couldn't surface safely, couldn't even breathe for long. A dead World War II submarine in mid-Atlantic is not a ship, it is a tomb. The chief engineer stepped forward. He would do the unthinkable, exit the submarine while submerged. With the boat held at 40 feet, he climbed into the escape chamber, sealed. It flooded it and stepped into the black water outside the hull. Holding his breath, he scraped at the intake grate with a steel bar. Once, twice, 3 times. On his 4th attempt, he nearly drowned. The crew dragged him back inside unconscious. 3 minutes later, coughing seawater, he gave a weak nod. The intake was clear. The engine roared back to life. 10 days later, the heat became unbearable. Schäffer made a decision that violated every instinct he had learned as a U-boat officer. U-977 surfaced in broad daylight just west of the Cape Verde Islands. The crew staggered onto the deck like ghosts blinking in the sun. Some cried, some simply sat down and breathed. That afternoon, at the rocky shore of Branco Island, they anchored and swam in the open ocean. 32 skeletal men rediscovering what it meant to be human. It lasted 4 hours. Then the hatch closed again. The steel coffin descended, and Argentina was still thousands of miles away. When U-977 finally appeared off the coast of Mar del Plata on August 17, 1945, the war had been over for more than 3 months. To the outside world, a lone German U-boat, resurfacing in South America, was not a curiosity, it was a shock. Rumors erupted immediately. Nazi gold, high-ranking fugitives, even whispers that Hitler himself had made the journey. Argentina, already under scrutiny for its German sympathies, found itself at the center of an international storm. Pressure from Washington was immediate. The United States demanded answers, and within days, the 32 skeletal men from U-977 were flown to American custody. What followed was one of the most detailed interrogations ever conducted by the Office of Naval Intelligence. Each man was questioned separately, their statements compared line by line with the submarine's meticulously kept logbook. Investigators wanted to know everything. Had U-977 stopped along the African coast? Had it landed agents, fired torpedoes after the ceasefire, carried passengers during its long submarine escape to Argentina? Again and again, the crew gave the same account. Days, submerged, nights surfacing only when necessary, and a direct path across the Atlantic that allowed no detours and no secret cargo. It was the fuel records that convinced the Americans. When the submarine surrendered, it carried less than 500 gallons of diesel, barely enough to maneuver, let alone stage a clandestine mission. The numbers matched the route described by Heinz Schäffer, and they left little room for conspiracy. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the loss of the cruiser Bahia had sparked its own suspicions. A warship exploding and sinking on July 4th, while a World War II submarine was known to be in the general region, was too convenient for some. But technical analysis revealed the truth. An accidental anti-aircraft burst had struck depth charges stored on the cruiser's stern. U-977 had been 600 miles away, struggling to repair its overheating engine. By late 1945, Allied intelligence reached a consensus. There was no secret mission, no fugitives, no gold, just a damaged German U-boat and a young crew trying to avoid what they feared would be harsh captivity. And yet, the myths refused to die, perhaps because the truth, stripped of sensationalism, revealed something more complex and more human. That sometimes survival itself can look like a conspiracy to those who have never had to fight for it. When the war ended, many stories faded quietly into the rubble of a broken world. But the voyage of U-977 never quite disappeared. Long after the Atlantic salt was washed from its decks, long after its steel hull was sunk as a target off Cape Cod, the questions lingered. Why had a battered German U-boat dared to cross an entire ocean after its nation had already ceased to exist? What drove 32 young men to stake their future on a machine held together by rust, luck, and borrowed time? For Heinz Schäffer, the answers were neither heroic nor dramatic. He returned to a devastated Germany in 1947 and found almost nothing of the life he had left behind. His father was gone. Berlin lay fractured between occupying powers. Many of his crew faced similar ruined homes, destroyed families scattered. The medic who had treated infections with engine grease went on to become a doctor. Others tried to bury the memories of heat, darkness, and fear deep enough that they might one day sleep without dreaming of it. Years later, when Schäffer settled in Argentina, the place that had once seemed like a distant promise on the horizon, he rarely spoke of the conspiracy theories that clung to his name. He said only, "We were young men who did not want to die in a prison camp." In the end, that simple truth carried more weight than all the rumors of Nazi treasure fugitive leaders or hidden Antarctic bases. The real story of the submarine escape to Argentina was not about gold or ghosts. It was about survival. And perhaps that is why the voyage of U-977 endures. Because it reveals something that war often hides: the quiet courage of ordinary people facing impossible choices. A failing engine repaired in darkness, discipline maintained even when the flag above them had vanished, a crew of 32 refusing to surrender to heat, sickness, fear, or the vast, indifferent ocean. Schäffer's grave is marked with only his name, his years of life, and one final line. Commander U-977, no mention of the distance traveled, the months submerged, or the improbable endurance of a worn-out World War II submarine. Yet for those who know the story, that number alone is enough. As we look back, one question remains. What do we choose to remember from a war? The legends we invent, or the human endurance that made survival possible at all? If this journey speaks to you, we invite you to share your thoughts. And if you value stories where history and humanity meet, consider joining us for the next chapter. There are many more untold paths waiting beneath the surface.